In 1992, I was walking around my second home, Streetlight Records, on Market Street, downtown San Francisco. It's where I first discovered bands such as Red House Painters, The Chills, and many others. Down below, upstairs, I stumbled upon a box full of CDs. They seemed unwanted. Treasure in my mind. My eyes first caught glance at a naked man or a woman finding comfort in water on the album cover. I saw the title Balloon, then Gravity. I wonder what this album was all about. I purchased it and immediately put it in my red Rocket Subaru CD player. From the opening notes of Why Did It Take So Long to the thrilling and haunting sounds of Tightrope Walker, this album has never left my side. In fact, in 2012, my fifth grade students at the time learned to sing Tightrope Walker and loved singing it out loud every chance they got the opportunity. I wish I'd recorded one of their singing sessions. One of the key players on that album was the multi-instrumentalist David John Sheppard. 32 years later, here we are. Let's welcome David for a conversation that promises to be filled with inspiration, a little bit of nostalgia, and a deep appreciation for the art that moves us all, music and cinema. Hello, David. How are you doing?
Hi, William. Thank you for having me. I'm doing very well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being part of Surprise Casts. Let's get started with some questions, shall we? And I want to start off with this one. I want to know, what were you like as a child? Give us a little background on your childhood experience, please.
What was I like as a child? I was like everyone else as a child. I was experimenting with play. A lot of what I experimented with play in my childhood was about music, actually. One of my earliest memories is being given a plastic Beatles guitar by my folks. I had 4 strings and had a picture of the Fab Four on it. It was orange. And I didn't really play it, but what I was really like doing was bowing, because on the TV all the time you saw the Beatles, and at the end of every song they bowed in unison. And so my main thing was to have the guitar and bow. I was that kind of kid, whatever kind of kid that is. So yeah, I was into music from kind of in a kind of performative way from quite an early stage. But like everyone, I got into music through the radio, and I had an older brother and an older sister, and so records came in. My sister was of the age of kind of late 60s singles, so we had all Motown and all that kind of stuff. My brother's a bit younger, so he was more into kind of rock stuff, and then the punk thing hit when I was just about a teenager. So all of these stages were incredibly influential. But as a child, I was into art. I was really good at art at school, and art and writing. Not very good at maths. Nothing's changed there. And music, yeah, and but I didn't really do formal music. Could have done music at school, but I was in the school orchestra. I played glockenspiel, an instrument I kind of went back to 40 years later. But it was one of these really simple things where you could actually separate each note. It had a little weight underneath it. So you could just separate the 4 notes that you needed for the melody that you're supposed to play and actually put them in order and do that. And yeah, my mallet's technique hasn't improved much since then. But all these things, yeah. So there was some signs of what was to come kind of quite early on in my childhood.
What was your relationship with your mother and father?
Very supportive, actually, my folks. I think because I was the youngest of 3, my elder brother and sister kind of went through all the discipline stuff. And by the time I arrived, it was the 60s, and yeah, I got a kind of easy ride, I guess.
Tell us exactly where you grew up and how does that play a role in the music that you create today?
Wow, that's a tough question to answer. So I grew up in a suburb of London, South London suburb, quite a anonymous, sprawling place that in a way was too close to central London to have its own identity, and not far enough away from London to have its own identity. But it was this kind of liminal space somewhere between. between, the throbbing city and the kind of countryside. It was neither one thing nor the other. What did that do? Well, what that did actually was it encouraged lots of people who were seeking another way of living other than the kind of orthodox get your qualifications, get a job in an office and all that stuff, to kind of congregate together. So there was a kind of little clique, if you like, of refuseniks who used to hang out, not necessarily to play music, but just to drink, mostly, to be honest, and just be, I guess, the phrase people would use subsequently, be, live a kind of alternative kind of existence. And this was just, before everyone disappeared off to university or art school and all that stuff. But it was definitely a kind of the kind of anonymity and, if you like, and I'm sure this is not a unique experience, but the anonymity and the kind of dreary banality of suburban life kind of forced people together who rejected that to some degree. And that was definitely an influence on later, decisions and tastes, I guess.
That location, has it changed over the years, or is it still kind of the same?
I haven't been back very much because I don't have any family living there anymore. But the last time I went there, it had changed, not for the better. No way. So even some of the kind of, the more romantic elements of like that fabulous ice cream parlor that we remember, stuff like that, all gone, all replaced by kind of chain shops and, big brand, all that stuff. Not completely, but, dispiritingly. Those places, because wherever you grow up in a childhood and you have these formative experiences, you kind of log them like photographs, don't you? And which you revisit every now and again for a kind of nostalgic hit. And then when you go and look at those photographs or the things that were photographed in your memory for real, they're not there anymore. That's quite a kind of psychic kick. So yeah, it's and as a result, I don't really think about that place anymore. I don't really have nostalgia. But I have nostalgia, obviously, for people and my parents, our family, a garden that we played cricket in with kids and stuff like that. But not so much really something which I won't even name because it doesn't deserve publicity.
You had mentioned the Beatles guitar, older brother and sister exposing you to music. As you were formulating and kind of chiseling and carving out your own desire for music and own different genres, what bands really started to grab hold of you in terms of your interest?
Well, it's like everybody, it's like life, especially music, anything you're introduced to when you go from kind of childhood into adolescence is really key and informative things. I mean, the early, I remember buying first singles I bought were kind of glam rock, stuff like that. And then it was punk. And I was kind of slightly too young for punk, so I couldn't really participate. I couldn't go to the shows, but I could buy the records. So it was, again, this is a very universal experience. It was the Ramones and Clash and all that kind of stuff, because it was like a cartoon, and it had all the energy, and life is cartoon energy when you're 13. So I was perfect time for that. But it didn't really last long because what it did make me do was realize the fumbling guitar that I was learning. My brother had a guitar. He was quite a good guitar player and a good bass player. The fumbling through that suddenly took on a lot more meaning because my kind of lack of virtuosity suddenly was no longer a barrier and the gates were open. So those are really important. But the first band that kind of transcended all that and has stayed with me as a kind of influence was television, particularly, Marquee Moon. That to me sounded like this is a different genre. This is a different kind of music. It's not rock music. It's not pop music. It's not jazz. It seemed kind of like it had been beamed from another dimension somehow. And it somehow kind of triggered something that you could do music that had all this dynamic and romance and sort of swagger that rock music had, but without any of the cliches. and it felt like it had some of the kind of the reach and the breadth of classical music, which I had also had some interest in, because my parents listened to some classical music, pretty obvious stuff. But so that was like a real mind-bending kind of introduction, I think, Marquee Moon. And this record has just stayed, because I don't think it's been bettered ever since, So, you were asking earlier before we actually did this about records that have stayed with me. And I'm sure we can come back to that, but that's definitely one of them. I really followed Tom Verlaine's career quite closely. I met him a few times actually, which was a bit like, a bit of a sort of, I don't know what the word for that is really. Kind of epiphany, I guess. Actually meet the person who kind of carved these amazing kind of cultural spaces in my life, sort of thing, and his records. That's how I think of them, as these tablets of stone, So yeah, sorry, a very long answer to a short question, but yeah, Marquee Moon by Television. Very key record.
Thank you for sharing that. And you're not the only musician that has brought up that seminal album. It just continues to bring down the line as far as influence. Thank you. Okay, so you're drawing all this inspiration from music in your life, television, punk music, Ramones, all that. When did you realize, now I'm a listener, but now I can actually become a participant and start playing music? So
I formed my own little punk band called, I think it changed several times. Somewhere I've got the cassette, that'd be good. It was in 1978. I was 13, 14. And it's called The Unwanted or The Unchanged. I don't even remember what it was. Some really kind of punky, but not very good name. And we went into a studio. I played bass because it was 3 notes, and I sang. And my brother, who could play, played guitar. And we got a drummer. And we went into a 16-track studio. I don't know how we paid for that. I don't even remember. And we did 2 tracks, all down live, overdubbed the vocal. And then I made cassettes, and I went to the local library where there was a photocopy machine to make the sleeve, because that was as close as you get to sort of self publication. And I think we made about 10 and then sold them at school, that kind of thing. I gave them away, I can't remember. Anyway, so that was kind of, and people quite liked it. It'd be really embarrassing to do now, but I quite liked it, and that made me think, well, that's quite good, that shows me something, kind of the inevitable imposter syndrome was always there with all creative acts, I think, suddenly was dissipated a little bit. And so I guess that was the first step on the ladder,
Were your parents supportive of that little endeavor?
Yeah, they were. I don't think they really understood it. I mean, every now and again, my father would come in, and so I did get a lot of records. Any money I had was spent on singles, mostly. And my dad would come in and had headphones. I listened, jigging around in the chair. And my dad would come and say, let me listen to some of this stuff, and he would just laugh. Generally just laugh at that, I guess, at the kind of primitiveness of the music. But he would just laugh, and he'd say, well, if that's what you want to do, carry on. So I think they just thought because I did a lot of, I was into visual art, and I was doing art at school, and I think they just thought it was all, he's going to be one of those guys, So, which my other siblings weren't. They were much more level-headed. A bit more straight down the line. Well, my brother had his moments, but yeah, I think again, being the youngest, I was given carte blanche. Just okay, well, let's let him do his thing. I was lucky.
Let's advance forward a little bit. You studied film and art history at art school in Sheffield. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So I want to know 2 things. What was that experience like? Number 1. Extracting those experiences, how do you apply them to today?
Oh, that's a really good question. What was it like? It was absolutely brilliant. I loved it. I loved it. I mean, I lived in London, and most people who wanted to have an exciting, leave home and have an exciting next stage in their life would probably move to London to do that. But I didn't want to do that because I would be too close to home, and I wanted to go somewhere and actually start afresh, as it were. And at that time, which was the early 80s, you had this blossoming music culture in this country, where the provinces, as they were rather negatively described, but in northern Britain, basically, you had Manchester with Factory Records, you had Leeds with Fast Records, you had Postcard Records in Glasgow, you had all these independent scenes blossoming, and you had a thriving music press, which I loved. I mean, I was absolutely, we had 4 weekly music papers, which is hard for the, people who were born as digital natives to think of, that your community, your discourse about music all came from these, what we call the inkies, because the ink came off on your fingers, as they were so called. Yeah, the inkies. NME, Melody Maker, Sounds, Record Mirror. And I bought them all religiously. I kind of lived for the day, the week when you could dive in. And discovering the music, at this point, we were kind of into post-punk, right? So the process there is music that was celebrated not necessarily for its hook lines or its accessibility, but for its innovativeness. The whole thing was, the reviews were a good review was, I've never heard anything quite like this before. And that was definitely a key sort of trigger, I think, to my own kind of creativity. Anyway, one of these cities was Sheffield in South Yorkshire, 160 miles north of London, but it felt like a different space. We were also living then in the early days of Thatcher and the Conservative clampdown, but in Sheffield, they called itself the Socialist Republic of South Yorkshire. Under the local town hall had the red flag flying up, and they were actually very resistant to the Westminster government, and they formed their own kind of enclave there. So it was like it's like kind of going from West Berlin to East Berlin, but a kind of funky one with no Stasi, It was a great city to be 18 in and free. And, education was paid for then back in those days before Thatcher had got rid of all that. I had full grants during the holidays. I got welfare, and my rent was paid. So we were there just living. We didn't have a lot of money, but we had enough money to survive and we did bands and art projects, and it was a fabulous time to be alive, even though, a couple of years later we had the miners' strike here, which was this big fulcrum moment which happened also in South Yorkshire, which was almost like this medieval face-off between the working class people and the police, who were kind of like the stormtroopers of Thatcherism. Anyway, we don't need to go too much into political history, but it was a particular place at a particular time, and it had an enormous effect on me, it being there. I really went because I loved this band Cabaret Voltaire, kind of very early experimental electronic duo who had their own studio called Western Works, which was part of the old steel industrial buildings in Sheffield, which was the home of steel making in Britain. And this whole romantic idea of creating this music that didn't sound like anything before, but had a kind of organic quality, even though it was somewhat synthetic in its the way it was made. But it just felt like it was kind of a natural outgrowth of this industrial context, if you like. And it was brilliant. We'd just go and hang out with these people who would the week before had been on the front cover of the NME, So it was, which you wouldn't be able to do in London. In a small city, the scene is accessible. So it was, a really, really important time for me. I did lots of music that nothing actually came to anything, but I did my degree, and I met lots of people, and was just sort of inspired that I think I'd chosen the right kind of lane in life. I need to do some of this crazy stuff. And it's good. I loved art school because it was just loads of people who didn't really know what they wanted to do, but just wanted to experiment with things. And it wasn't like it is now here, where you have to have a lot of money to be able to afford to do these things. So it was a much more level playing field. And so you had, met people of all walks of life in a way, intermingling, united by the fact that they were trying to make something that had never been seen or heard before. Failing, usually, but it was a beautiful failure. It was a kind of noble, a kind of nobility. But yeah, that was key to my kind of evolution of my thinking about stuff, going to art school.
What a wonderful city that has hosted so many bands. Def Leppard, Pulp, one of my favorites, Richard Hawley.
Yeah, Richard Hawley. There was a great band called Concert Angels as well. I don't know if you know them, who were very influenced by television, actually. There were lots of other groups. Clock DVA were great. There was a great punk band, 2.3. There was a very rich culture of music in Sheffield.
Human League.
Joe, of course.
Cocker, yeah.
Human League. They were kind of. I remember when the Human League, the local newspaper, I think it's called the Star, Sheffield. And if you walk through the centre of town, they had these, the billboards. They was on the front cover of the. And I remember it was League hit US #1. That was the tone. That's when they went to #1 with Don't You Want Me in 1980, whatever that was, 1982. Yeah. So they were kind of, city was proud of its musical. ABC, they were happening there as well.
So you talked about the music side of this environment. I want to know, did you really take a deeper dive into film? And if you did, tell me about that experience, because I'm a massive cinephile.
Okay. Good to hear. Yeah, me too. I already was a fledgling one at 18. Before I went to college, my idea of heaven was to go into the centre of London in the daytime, go to a place called the Academy Cinema on Oxford Street, and catch films like Elephant Man that just come out, David Lynch, and be the only person in the cinema practically, because it was the first showing. And I loved that. And you could smoke cigarettes in those days. I remember sitting there, smoking away. I don't think I even smoked. It was just I was going to do it in the cinema because it felt kind of cool. But it was, things like that. So yeah, I was into movies. I'd kind of chosen this course because it was it was actually art, design, and film studies. And if you could have done a degree in popular music, which you now can do, obviously, I probably would have done that. It was as near as I could get at that time. But I was into movies, and it made me more of a cinephile, definitely doing it, because we basically watched 2 or 3 brilliant films from the great canon of Western and other cinemas every day. And there was also a film society which we ran as part of our course, so we could get in, and they were all projected, and there's no digital stuff. And we had our own little cinema, which was part of the college. And so it was fantastic. I mean, it's just great being introduced to, I don't know, like even things like Hollywood, like film noir. I didn't really know much about film noir. I just knew Humphrey Bogart, being introduced to genres like that properly, but also, Russian films, German expressionists, seeing The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari for the first time and things like that, and thinking, wow, this is art. Wow, this is something else. And this was from 1924. Absolutely revelatory. All the Eisenstein stuff and the Russian Revolution, the Vertov's Man with the movie camera, just being introduced to those things when you're 18. And all around you in the world of cinema, I guess it's the early days of rom-coms and Star Wars and whatever, Raiders of the Lost Ark. And it's like, no, here's the secret language. This is the stuff you really want to, And that included Antonioni and the Fellini movies, which I still love. So some of my favorite films. Yeah, so it's just a brilliant introduction. Then learning film language as well, learning about cinematography and sound and editing and mise en scène and all this stuff. And brilliant, having seminars talking about construction of films. Wonderful. Because, when you go from school in this country to university, I'm sure it's the same where you are, but it's a big leap. You go from this kind of pedagogy of sort of just learn this and pass your exams to, hey, look at this wonderful creative infinity. What do you make of it? You know, pick the bones out of that, which is quite a challenge, but it's also amazingly fun. It makes you grow, makes your brain grow. So yeah, I did really enjoy my 3 years there.
May I ask you a question regarding your love for cinema?
Sure.
In relation to some of your songs, and we'll take a deeper dive later. But in terms of filmmakers, Peter Weir, Terrence Malick, directors who have used landscapes as almost a character in a film, very important. When I hear the Vertical Land album, it kind of conjures up these images from their movies. So my question is this, David. It may not be those specific directors, but are there directors' work that you think somehow manifest themselves inside the work you do as a musician? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's a tough question to that's a good question, a tough one to answer. But I think some of the things you mentioned have definitely had some impact. Terrence Malick's Badlands and the use of that music, you can see some parallels there. But I think a person who's really important to me was Nick Roeg as a film director. And the first film of his I ever saw was Walkabout, which I don't know if you've seen. Marvelous film. And that's the great Australian outback of this wonderful orchestral score. And I think that has definitely had an impact on me musically. But I don't think that's quite the answer you're looking for. You're talking more about a kind of an analogy here. And I understand what you mean. I think there is something that in Roeg's films have this incredible quality of dislocated time, where there's no linear time. Things are chopped up, and it's like being inside someone's head. So a memory is coinciding with a forward projection, and that's the wonder of his editing. And I've often thought about that when I've got a piece of instrumental music that is working but doesn't necessarily have a kind of narrative that I feel is fulfilling what I set out to do. And sometimes it's a matter of actually taking something Jean-Luc Godard said, which is the film has a beginning, a middle, and an end, not necessarily in that order, and taking that quite literally and like putting the beginning at the end and the end at the beginning, and suddenly having this narrative was latent within this stuff. I just needed to throw it up in the air and let it land where it falls. So that's a kind of slightly circuitous answer to your question. But yes, broadly, I think there is definitely some crossing between sort of film language and musical language. Definitely. And I do love film soundtracks. Obviously, that's big influence for me. People like Morricone, particularly.
I think you and I would have gotten along just fine at that art college. Okay. So the listener cannot see what is in my hand, but I'm going to describe it. And here in my hand, listeners, is the album Balloon. Gravity is the name of the album. Band name is Balloon. And this is the album that drew me to David in terms of its production, its lyrics, its vocal melodies. There is an air of mystery, an enigma to these songs. There's romance. There's tragedy. So, David, my first question is, how did your experience with Balloon come about?
So Balloon is basically two people. It's Ian Bickerton, who's really the main person. He's a songwriter, he's a singer. And me, who's I was the band, if you like. And we had various formations. That we did have bigger bands in it, but it was always about him and I. How it started actually was after the sort of college period. Ended up going back to London and having a period of where nothing was working out. I had to go back and live with my parents for a while. Nearly all of our contemporaries had sort of set off on their life journeys. They were getting married, or they were, doing it, starting their sort of proper jobs, all that kind of stuff. We were back in this dreary South London suburb, and it's Ian and I were we've been washed up back where we started. Both, I mean, he'd been doing journalism, but he quit that for some reason. I can't remember exactly why. But anyway, so we were kind of kicking around and saying, well, let's do something, because he'd had bands before, and they'd sort of come close to being quite significant, but nothing had really happened. And so I said, well, let's do so. That's how it started, basically. And we weren't really into anything that was going on in late 80s UK music. It was kind of lame. So that's the time that the Nick Drake stuff first got re-released. I remember sitting around listening to that. We listened a lot to Bob Dylan and like early, like the Subway Sect and some more obscure punk stuff. The more kind of esoteric end of that as well, which would even then seemed like, wow, this is kind of a nostalgia trip, even though it was only 10 years old. But it seemed like, anyway, so we were mixing all this stuff, trying to avoid sounding or being influenced by current thing. I can't exactly what was happening at that time. I guess it's just about to be the kind of rave scene that hadn't really kicked in yet. So it was a kind of, there was a couple of interesting bands in Australia, like the Triffids and the Go-Betweens. We listened to them. There were a few things happening on Creation Records, but generally, I guess the Jesus and Mary tune. But it didn't really feel like there was anything cohesive. Anyway, so we just kind of went literally into a bunk under Ian's house. They had a basement, and we went down there and just made this kind of, initially sounded like kind of public image, kind of screechy kind of stuff. Just a big kind of like, vomit of sound. That's how it started. That's the beginning. And then we just sort of, it took various iterations of the band. We had a violin player. We did lots of shows at one point, and we became went very folky, just through the songs that Ian was writing mostly. And he's really the person you need to talk to about this stuff. He's the songwriter. I co-wrote a few things, but it's nearly all him, and I would just make guitar arrangements for them and stuff like that. We had a violin player, and then we had a bigger band at one point. We played a big showcase for that. We got a manager. The guy who used to manage Dex's Midnight Runners was kind of looking after us briefly. And then eventually we made a couple of demos. Again, I think it's mostly Ian and I. We had this place in Brixton, the studio we used to go to from midnight until 6. And we would piece these songs together in the two of us. And I played, all the guitars, bass, drums, keyboard, just whatever was in the studio. Let's try and make it work. It was an absolutely terrible studio. Really, the sounded awful. Everything sounded awful, but it was cheap. So we just kept going back there. Anyway, we did it until we had enough for a demo, and we just sent it to everyone, all the labels. And I think a few people were interested, but the first one that showed any enthusiasm, a friend of mine actually heard about this new label, a journalist called David Belcher, a Scottish journalist, and he said, "Oh, my friend Karen has just co-formed this new label called Dedicated Records, which is part of RCA, BMG, RCA, but they've got their own thing. Send it to her." So we sent it to her, and she said, "We want to sign you," basically. So and it was like, well, hang on a minute, this is not supposed to. Yeah, it was like the sort of dream that sort of happened after a period of, fields were left fallow for quite a long time, and then suddenly the rains came. And
wait. So once you get that news, are you completely over the moon?
Yes, yeah, we are. We're both. I'm not sure. Ian might have been. I was running a bookstore in Covent Garden. I was managing that, and I had real trouble with my staff because if I wasn't working, they just wouldn't open the shop. So there was all sorts of problems. It was a lovely shop, but it just wasn't very open enough. But it was like, to me, so I was having all these problems, and then we got signed, and it was like, okay, I can quit. That's great. That was the most exciting thing. So I think that was by then. We're talking about 1990 now. I think somewhere 89, 90, maybe even 91. I think 90. And Yeah, so we quit, and then we had enough money, and we were very sensibly paid ourselves like a minimum out of the. But that was still in the days when major record labels would take a punt on a new thing. So there was a bit of money. The publishing, we didn't have a publishing deal, but that was all floating around. Anyway, so yeah, that's really how it began. So then our first job, we sat down with this guy Doug Darcy, who ran the label, and he said, "Your songs are really interesting, but your demo is absolutely awful. You need a producer." so it's, and it was, who would you like? Who would you like? And I remember Ian wanted Bones Howe. Bones Howe would produce some Tom Waits record. He was impossible. But it was suggested to us that we listen to this record by Mary Margaret O'Hara called Miss America, which you may well know. Beautiful record. It's produced by Michael Brooke. And Michael Brooke, I knew Michael Brooke because he had worked with Eno, but also because he produced a record by Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. I really loved Quali record. Yeah, what it's called now. That's how much I loved it. It was, at the time, it was sort of it was the record that I played all the time. And his record sounded amazing. He had this clarity, crystalline tonality in his records. So we met Mark. It just so happened he was living in London. He was sharing an apartment with Daniel Lanois, in fact, in West London. Yeah, I mean, Daniel lived in New Orleans, but his London apartment was in Westbourne Park, near Notting Hill. And Michael had set up a studio there, so that that's where we started making actually we had a couple of false starts with the record, but essentially once we got with Michael, that's when we started making Gravity. And a lot of it was made, beginning was made in this third floor tiny walk up apartment on the Harrow Road in West London. That's where we kind of mapped it out and did some of the early stuff, which is on the record. And then it was put to us by Mike. He said, well, Daniel's saying, would we like to go to his Kingsway studio in the French Quarter of New Orleans to finish it off with some local musicians? So, of course, we said, no, we don't want to do that. That sounds terrible. No, of course, we said, yes, we definitely want to do that. And so we flew out in May of 91, I think that must have been. We flew out into it. It was amazing because it was like dropping into a song off of Rain Dogs by Tom Waits, kind of this teeming. It was raining, a proper, Louisiana rain. I think we spent 2 or 3 weeks there, and it was great. So we used lots of local musicians. But I mean, I have to be honest with you. If I look back at it now, I kind of think I could do a lot more with it if it happened today. It was a bit, kind of a bit daunting. I was a bit overawed almost by this wonderful place. This house, Kingsway. It was a big old mansion, basically, late 1800s, full of kind of worn up, kind of, wood, ornate kind of stucco walls. But Lanois, he just finished recording Peter Gabriel there, and Harold Budd literally just got, and who else? And the day we got there, Buffy St. Marie was just finishing. So we went out to dinner with Buffy St. Marie into a place. They took us, I think Mark Howard and one of the other engineers, they took us down to a place which is gone now because Katrina took it away. But it's somewhere in the 9th ward or the 8th ward or something like that. And it's just this shotgun shack house. And these two, what seemed to me then quite elderly, they probably weren't that elderly, but they seemed quite elderly people who would just cook us up some soul food. And they had a jukebox. And the jukebox just had the most amazing blues records. And this was an introduction to New Orleans. It was absolutely like a movie, completely like a movie. We had completely jet lagged, and then we were eating kind of grits, whatever they are, and listening to Howlin' Wolf, and drinking a Budweiser. It was kind of it was great with Buffy St. Marie.
So okay, you're with Michael. Well, working with Michael Brooke.
Yeah.
There's a song on here. Okay, can you tell me, based on memory, some of these songs you lent backing vocals? Is that correct?
1 or 2, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So you're kind of doing all the music. Ian's doing lyrics, singing, correct?
He's also playing some keyboards. Yeah, he's a good keyboard player, actually.
You're playing the marimba, you're doing xylophone, slide guitar, all that. There's a song on here that I mentioned earlier called Tightrope Walker. And very few people know that there are backing vocals by an artist, and her name is Sarah McLachlan. How the hell do you get Sarah McLachlan?
So Sarah was recording her second record, I think, also in New Orleans at the same time. And she was being produced by another Canadian, Pierre Marchand. Pierre Marchand was friends with Michael. So there was some correspondence, and they were all friends with Lanois, basically. And so she just came to hang out one day when we were finishing up. We went to dinner somewhere. And then when we came back from dinner and said, "Do you want to do some vocals?" So she said, "Sure." So it was incredibly casual. And she's a complete first take singer, amazing singer. And she sang on 2 or 3 songs, actually, but the other 2 songs did. Somewhere I've got, there's definitely one other, possibly 2 others. And somewhere I've got the demos of that. Ian will definitely have them. He probably has more versions.
Wow. Okay, so on Tightrope Walker, the song builds and swells, epic chorus, wonderful middle 8, and then it takes off again. A lot of people don't know the story behind that song. It's pretty tragic.
It's kind of dark.
Yeah. And is about a kidnapping, is that correct?
No, I don't think it is about kidnapping. But you know what? It could just as well be. This is a song that is something about school, about the oppression of the British grammar school system, would you believe? Which is, Ian's school was, we both went to these grammar schools, right, which was kind of halfway between a regular high school and a kind of what you would call a private school, or we call confusing a public school. So, yeah. Well, whichever way you look at it, it's halfway between a private school and a public school. But those things mean different things to you than they do to me. But they had this very old-fashioned kind of disciplinarian approach. And we both went to all-boys schools, right? All-boys schools. That was a big mistake. And that had a lot of not on us, I don't think particularly, but generally on very, very repressed young men would come out of these schools with absolutely horrendous maladjustment to relationships with the opposite sex. Anyway, that's not what the song's about necessarily. The song is actually about the headmaster, who was the complete, his headmaster at that school, I think, was a complete kind of tyrant. And it's about wanting to kill him. Anyway, and having this thought, I want to kill this guy. And I don't know if you've seen that movie If by Lindsay Anderson. Have you seen that film? Recommend it. Recommend this film, which is about school kids basically revolting against a repressive system. Anyway, there's a bit of that film is in that song. But it's also, what happened was that very soon after Ian was having these thoughts, it actually happened. Not to his headmaster, but to some kids did kill a headmaster just for that. So that's part of it. There's more to it than that. That it's analogous with broader things. So your idea of a kidnapping could well be. You would have to ask Ian, because it's a very personal lyric to him. That what I've told you is all I can remember our conversations about it.
Well, that makes sense, because H for hatred, now the old man has plans to make it. All of our lives we have plotted our revenge. Now someone's done it. Trust to my lucky dice, my rusty pocket knife. High in the Shannon, I hang for all to see.
Yeah, and the guy, I think he was hung. Or was he stabbed? Anyway, I can't remember. All of those things have some relevance to.
Okay.
Yeah, but I feel bad kind of trying to be the explanatory person here because
no.
Not my lyrics.
This is fantastic. Okay, so we move on past Balloon. I want to know, right here in my hand, I'm holding an album. This is Drums Between the Bells, Brian Eno and the words of Rick Holland. I know you're a massive Brian Eno fan. You wrote a book about it. So why is Brian Eno so important to you?
I think what's really interesting about Brian is the way that he kind of existed in the world of, at the level of rock music and rock discourse and pop music. He was in that world, but he never seemed to be of that world. And what I found most interesting as someone who, as a teenager, was a rabid consumer of the music press, was Brian Eno's interviews, closely followed by David Bowie and David Byrne's interview, were always a cut above everybody else's. They were just so interesting. They were always about the creative process. They were always bringing in references to other parallel fields. They weren't talking about, lots of bands at that time were kind of over romancing rock as a kind of idiom, the idea of, as a kind of libertarian idiom, something like that. This was much more cerebral, and of course he would be stereotyped as the boffin and all that kind of stuff, which I get that, and it was quite humorous and all that, but he was genuinely, what he was doing was bringing ideas from fine art, because he'd studied at art school, and I got that. And he was bringing loads of fine art ideas into music, idea of, chance as a creative tool and all these things which I'd kind of independently at least touched upon. But yet he was this massive star, so he was doing all the crazy art stuff whilst having all this cachet, and reverence from fans. And I just thought that's a much more interesting route that he's taken than, and all the things he did, I loved before he even got to his. The first record of his that I really knew was Another Green World, which is still my favorite because it's just such a beautiful thing. It's a funny record. You asked me earlier, and the records are perfect. I don't think it's a perfect record because it's a bit of a mess in some ways, but it's everything on it is just compelling in its own way. The sounds of the innovativeness of it, the fact that it doesn't really sound like anything else. And at that time, that was, as I said earlier, that was hugely significant. And you could play this have you heard this? People go, wow, I love this. What is it? So that to me is Brian Eno. I love this. What is it? Quite a kind of key idea. So it was like the mystery, and it was a door opener for all sorts of other things, because he touched, everything from John Cage through Cluster and Kahn and Krautrock on one side, to things, much more experimental things like Christian Wolff and so on and so forth, and he would tell you about them in his interviews, and his discourse would embrace all these things. But he also loved funk, he loved Afrobeat, he loved Fela Ransom Kuti, and then that was impacting his production of Talking Heads, who prior to that had been the punk band, a bit like Television and the Right, and I already liked them, and suddenly Eno is impacting on this thing and turning it into a new thing. And when Remain in Light came out, 1980, was it 80, I think. That's probably, that's another record, like Marquee Moon. I think I can go back to that record. Definitely go back to that. And don't think that felt like it could have been the beginning of a whole genre that has never really been explored any further. You look back from this distance and you can see some issues with it in terms of, co-option of African ideas and African music. But I don't think that's actually, I write about a little bit about this in the book, but I don't think that's an accusation that anyone was making at the time. That's a bit of wisdom onto the event. But then just in terms of the pure musical experience, it's an amazing accomplishment. It's got a massive hit single on it, but it's really music without chord changes. right? It's just all layers, and it's about when you bring things in and out. And that's been a big influence on me, that process of that record.
Have you met Brian Eno?
Yes.
Can you tell us that experience?
Well, the first time I met Brian was when we were recording Balloon. And it's also in the book. I don't think I mentioned the band by name, but I was doing an guitar overdub in this flat in West London. It was really difficult, and I was having problems with it. And the doorbell went. And I was like, I've got to stop. Doorbell went, and this guy appeared, very anonymous looking guy in jeans and a t-shirt. And he wanted to talk to Michael about his cutlery. Because he knew that Michael had some posh fish knives, and he wanted to look at them because he was going to buy some. Anyway, it dawned on me during this conversation that was going on in the kitchen, and this was a tiny flat, right? This apartment, and this conversation was going. That's Brian Eno. That's Brian. He's very small. He's much smaller than you think. Brian. He's quite slight, so he doesn't really have a big. And he sort of has a purposeful anonymity about him, but it's very obviously him. And so, yeah, it was very amusing kind of an Eno moment, the fish knives. And then he made a couple of notes in his notebook about the fish knives, and then he bid us farewell. He said, good luck with the session. So that's the first time I met him. And then a bit later, when I was working as a journalist, I interviewed him a couple of times for magazines. And we knew each other, and of course, because we had the Michael Brooke connection, it was made it a bit easier to converse with him. So I've been to his studio a few times and talked with him, for various things. So that's when it came to doing the book as well, that was another kind of open gate kind of thing, making that happen.
Legendary stories, I'm sure. David, thank you for sharing and reminiscing about those times with regards to someone that has inspired you, Mr. Brian Eno. Amazing. Okay. Book is written on some faraway beach. Then you start moving into other territories in terms of music. Your State River widening, Ellis Island Sound, Snow Palms. Would you care to share anything based on those experiences?
Yeah, so some of that stuff actually begins before the book. It begins really. So I kind of, after the balloon thing, for me, the balloon thing kind of finished in around 93, 94. Ian carried on with it for a little while, but I was kind of done with it by then. But I had started writing journalism at that point. That's really how I was earning my living, actually, writing music stuff, which I still do, something I still do. And that began on the balloon, one of the 2 US tours that we did. The second one was with Sarah McLachlan, but the first one was just on our own. And I'll just cut this story very short because it's long. But we were asked by the promoter, a man called Marty Mad Dog Diamond, to write a tour diary. Now, tour diary in 1992 was not as common a thing it is in the world of, doing blog on the road, right? It involved writing something on a piece of paper, putting it in an envelope and posting it back from City back to New York, to where the promoter was based. And we were asked, he said, do it because it might be a really interesting, tour diary. You might do something with it at the end. Nobody really wanted to do it in the band because it was, but those journeys between, Frisco and Portland along between gigs. So, and the freeway is pretty boring once you've been on it for a while. So I ended up writing this stuff, just write all the funny stuff that happened, impressions, just writing. I didn't really think about it very much. I didn't even do that many, but I did a few, and then I sent them back to Marty back in the Big Apple. Anyway, we completed this tour, and by the end, it was quite long, several weeks, but by the end, we were just about to fly back to London, and I was in the office. They said, just before you go, check this out. And he showed me a copy of College Music Journal, which was the kind of Bible of the college music radio scene, which was really, very vibrant at that time. And I said, we got a review. He said, no, you haven't got a review. Look in the middle. And in the middle, they published my diary verbatim, absolutely verbatim. And a big light bulb went off in my head as we were, in the jumbo jet flying back over it. I'm thinking, hang on, so all this music stuff, which is really hard, and we've just been, a couple of months around the US playing to 10 people, trying to get something happening. This thing I didn't even think about. It's in the middle of a magazine. So maybe I should think about this. That really was so I thank the whole balloon experience for setting me up as a writer, really. Anyway, sorry, that wasn't as short as I hoped it would be. But yes, I was writing by the balloon finished. I was writing, and I ended up writing for, what I started doing was actually I started listening much more widely. Because by that time we had a whole kind of thing happening with post-rock, with bands like Tortoise. We had some really interesting things happening in electronic music, Aphex Twin, one thing. I mean, lots of different. It reminded me a bit, that kind of 93 to 96 period, reminded me a bit of the late 70s, in that kind of innovativeness was back on the agenda. Music that you haven't necessarily heard before, or music that was influenced by things other than the canonical artists. So that was really interesting to me. And I started listening more, and that really inspired me, because I was a bit pissed off with music after all that stuff, actually making it. But that made me kind of want to make music again, just for the pure joy of doing it. So I started doing that without any thought even of releasing, just having some time in the studio, experimenting with sounds. And that's really where all this stuff started, all these projects started, like State River Widening, which was a kind of acoustic guitar thing, which came to me. I went to a wedding in Mexico. I was the best man, their friends. And I was left alone in a flat in Mexico City, and they had one record. It was Nick Drake, Pink Moon. One record. And I was saying this, and they didn't only have one record. That was the only record. I don't know. I think it was the only vinyl record. They had a turntable, and the CD player didn't work. They had lots of CDs, no CD player. So I could just play this one record. And I kept spinning it, and I'm thinking, what's really interesting is his guitar style. Really is interesting. And thinking, well, I could by that stage play guitar quite well. And I thought, okay, that's something. Wouldn't it be interesting to build an instrumental thing that was a bit like an electronic music, but on that kind of repetitive, rippling, arpeggiated guitar. And so that was the beginning of State River Widening. So that's what that was. So kind of Nick Drake meets post-rock meets electronica kind of thing. And then there were these other side projects, like Elephant Ensemble with my friend Pete Astor, singer songwriter, quite successful now. But that was a kind of, again, it was him doing the other kind of music. So, and there was quite a thriving small label scene, and we could put all this stuff out, and it was exciting. Snow Palms was a slightly later development from that, which was where I was exploring the mallet instruments again. Which is sort of, as I said, it goes right back to my infant school days. But so that's all that, and lots of different projects, making projects. The interesting thing is, I never really made any money out of Balloon, even though we had this big major label. We didn't really ever sell enough records, and we had, everything costs a lot of money, so we ended up owing the label. But being free to do all this experimental stuff, you didn't really have those considerations. It's all very small scale. It's just like, let's make this stuff for the love of it and sell it, and then move on to the next thing. And actually, in doing it that way, as a kind of kitchen table economics, you do actually make a little bit of money, and it's nice, it sort of sustains itself that way. And so we are doing that, and then kind of the weirdest thing was that because of being free to just compose the music that you want to do in that experimental way. And this goes back to Brian Eno, actually. Funnily enough, some of that stuff eventually, not that long after actually, but started to get picked up by film and advertising and stuff like that. Made way more money off of my crazy experimental music than I ever did off of, songs and verse, chorus, verse. So it's a kind of irony there. But it does take me back to why I like Brian Eno in the first place, which was, experimentation, but with a wide audience, right? So that's stayed with me. So that's all that stuff, basically.
Okay. Can we talk about Vertical Land? And I definitely want the listener to hear a song. This is a unique album going all the way back to my earlier part of the conversation with you. It has these lush soundscapes, if you will. The aesthetics on this beautiful. I love the rhythm. I love the tempo. I love the flow. I love the energy. There's a great atmosphere to these tracks. So give us a little background to Vertical Land, and then we're going to take a listen to a song. We'll listen to one of your songs, and you can analyze it.
Yeah, the Vertical Land came out in 2015, I think, and it followed a period of travel. I was traveling, not totally through my own volition, but some of it was for work. Anyway, it just turned out that between August and the end of October 2013, I was in Greek islands, Norwegian fjords, Welsh mountains, and Table Mountain, Cape Town, South Africa, for various reasons. I was just in all these massively impressive landscapes, and I just kept getting this feeling. I spent a long time, obviously, in planes flying over them, but also walking and just being. And this wonderful feeling, because I live in London right now, and a lot of the time it's, London is a glowering, so it's not like Frisco, where at least you have some days of sunshine. But you have mist and fog like we do. But it's it's kind of, there's a line in David Byrne's song, Cities, where it's, think of London, a small city, dark in the daytime. Yeah, it is not in the summer, but anyway, in the winter, it's very dark. And to get out into a landscape where you just feel like you're a tiny pinprick in this huge map of a kind of monolithic landscape, I just was really loved that feeling. And because I was just thrown into these different environments, and I just found it really inspiring musically. And I guess I might have even had a little iPad by then. I can't remember, but I certainly had some device, and I didn't have any instruments with me at all. I was like humming and singing and banging bits of wood together and rocks and just recording it as almost like kind of oral postcards, and that's really where it started. So the first track I started was this thing called a thumbnail sketch of infinity, which essentially what I was doing with those sketches, so a thumbnail sketch of this vastness, how can you put that into a song? And I started that song with a mountain dulcimer, just hitting this mountain dulcimer, making this kind of primal rhythm, and then building it up from there. And I did that and I think the song you're going to play is called Mountain Time, which is very much like that. It's kind of layers of iterative rhythm and melody, partly on kind of prepared piano and on harmonic guitar, lots of harmonic, detuned guitar, different harmonic interval, but play very instinctively. And going back to Remain in Light, the idea of there are no chord changes in the song. There are just textural dropouts and dropouts and then re-entries of different combinations. So the putting down the tracks didn't take that long, but mixing it took years, it felt like, because it was just trying to navigate a narrative out of this, by subtracting. It's a bit like pentimento in painting, where you put layers of paint on and you scrub away until you get a texture that you want. It's very much like that, and it took a while, but I'm not sure if we ever finished it. It's like a painting. When is it finished? You just agree to abandon it, right? At some point, there's one of those tracks, but it does have that. It definitely has that feeling that I picked up from some of Eno's work with Talking Heads, and also from African music, from particularly Afrobeat, which again, Afrobeat, krautrock records don't really have a lot of chord changes, but they have this propulsive, metronomic, motoric quality, and then the idea of textures dropping in and out against that. That's what I was trying.
Well, within that song, actually, let's take a listen to the song.
Okay.
This is Mountain Time from the Vertical Land album by David Sheppard. Okay. So after hearing this song, you nailed it in terms of all the layering textures. Was this song challenging to put together in terms of your approach, or did this just flow out of you?
It was easy in the sense of, because it wasn't written, nothing was written. You know, when the first part was put down, the recording light was on, and I just played. And I can't even remember what the first instrument. I think it's one of the guitars. I just played a repeating part, and then I responded to that with another part, and then I looked around the room, and then just picked up stuff, and until we built up this great wall of stuff. And then, as I said before, it was the process. Then the creative process was one of subtraction rather than addition. So it's like you've built your block of stone, now you've got to turn it into a sculpture. But which bits are you going to take off? So that's how that works.
So without getting too personal, David, in this exploration of your journey, this trek, if you will, to these different locations,
Yep.
Were you finding yourself? Was that kind of the purpose?
No, it really wasn't. It really wasn't. One of them, I mean, the Wales trip was a recording thing with so I was playing drums for somebody, and it was in this isolated place in the hills. The Greek islands was a holiday. Then where else was it? South Africa was making a movie with some students about the local music scene, which was an amazing experience in and of itself. The Norway thing, I was playing a festival with a friend of mine who I'm working with again now, actually, at the moment. No, it was pure happenstance. But they all happened to be these places that had this amazing monolithic kind of landscape quality to them. And it just really impacted on me, the fact that you could go all right around the world and feel the kind of geodesy and the enormity of the planet and one's kind of insignificance within that, yes.
Yeah. No, it's a beautiful record.
I mean, that's the feeling that it's if you were a romantic in the 19th century, you would call it the sublime, right? The quality of the sublime.
Right. Check it out, everyone. Vertical Land. Beautiful album. Thank you for that. Okay. What's coming down the line for you in 2024 and beyond?
So this year, there's a new edition of my book, the Eno book, for which I've written a new chapter. And there's a foreword being written by a novelist called Alan Warner. So it's been repackaged from a publisher called White Rabbit in the UK. I'm not sure what the US situation is at the moment, but I think it's going to have a life again. So I've been doing a lot of work on that, rejigging that. I'm teaching a lot. But the other thing I'm doing is I'm working with someone called Mark Fry, a musician called Mark Fry. A musician who's also a painter. He lives in France. He's English, but he's somebody who had a kind of made a cult record in the early 1970s, a kind of psych folk, really quite important now, viewed as quite important record called Dreaming with Alice. And I've been working with him, just done some shows with him in France, and in June, we're going over to Normandy I'm going to produce a record for him. So looking forward to that. That's the kind of next thing, the book, the record. And then it's finally going to make some more music of my own.
Wonderful. Can't wait for all that to hatch. We're going to actually skip over this question because I feel like you've kind of covered it, and that's flawless albums, if you will, and directors and so forth.
Oh, yeah.
I want to end this conversation with a couple passages from a book that I'm really enjoying. And when I read you these passages, I would love for you to just respond. This is called The Creative Act, A Way of Being, written by the legendary producer Rick Rubin, famously known for working with Beastie Boys. So, David, here is the first passage I want to read to you. And again, just your response would be welcome. In this chapter, he's talking about the end. What is he alluding to? Well, he's talking about the end of your work. How do you know what is the end? So let me read it. And here comes the question. If you've truly created an innovative work, it's likely to alienate as many people as it attracts. The best art divides the audience. If everyone likes it, you probably haven't gone far enough. In the end, you are the only one who has to love it. This work is for you. When is the work done? There's no formula or method for finding this answered. It is an intuition. The work is done when you feel it is. What's your response to that?
I have a lot of time for Rick. I think that's I agree with. I think, I don't know who said it and famously said that an artwork's never finished, merely abandoned. It might have been Picasso. And I think at some point you have to make a contract with yourself, particularly if you're someone who works in a particularly repetitive, iterative way, like I often do in the studio. I'm building things. I'm not working with a big ensemble, and we're not doing live takes. And okay, let's try another one. I'm beginning to want to make music that way. But when you're building stuff up, layering things, it's that process of when do we have enough layers? Am I saying what I wanted to say? And being able to step out of yourself enough to look at that and think, yes, I am, or yes, I'm not, or no, I'm not. That's actually, that is still the hardest thing, I think. It's still the hardest thing to know when a piece of work is done. But I think he's right in two ways. One, if you're making music that everybody you play it to loves, you probably have made a compromise somewhere that you didn't necessarily need to make. I agree with that. Finally, I think I agree with him in the idea that you have to love it. You have to love it enough to want to let it go. And I think that's a bit like when people use the analogy of, you make art. It's a bit like your kids. You do what you can for them. You put all the good stuff you can in them, but ultimately they've got to live, on their own. They've got to stand up on their own. And once you do release something into the world, it takes on its own identity to some degree, and you don't have any control over it anymore. And what's really odd, and I get this response when I talk to other musicians, they get it too, which is very often the thing that you've thought about least on a record is the one that everybody likes. Or the thing that you thought was, I'm not sure about that, that's the thing that people kind of somehow they focus on it. This seems to happen all the time. So I often wonder how much are we in control of our creative goals or our creative process. I think you put all the good stuff in there and you kick it out the door and then you see what happens.
What a fabulous answer. One more passage, if you don't mind.
Okay.
This chapter is called Non-Competition. Here it goes. Art is about the maker. Its aim, to be an expression of who we are. This makes competition absurd. Every artist's playing field is specific to them. You are creating the work that best represents you. Another artist is making the work that best represents them. The two cannot be measured against one another. Art relates to the artist making it in the unique contribution they are bringing to the culture. However, some may argue that competition inspires greatness. I want to know your thoughts on that.
Competition inspires greatness. This sounds to me a little bit too close to the false idea of kind of entrepreneurism in a way, which I find troubling in a kind of economic or commercial or political sense. I don't think art should ever be a competition. I don't think it's a competition. I mean, you have, there are competitions within art that you can take, but I don't think it should be. It's not a race. It's not a race. It's a ritual. We should not be trying to outdo each other. We should try to be learning from each other. We should try to be contributing to each other creatively and in other ways. And I don't think thinking of it as a competition is healthy. I think it promotes, in one sense, it's that I want to outdo somebody else. That can be a positive emotion, the idea because it means I want to get better at what I'm doing. And in that sense, I see some validity in it. But to sort of valorize the idea of competition as the engine of creativity, I don't agree with that. I believe in that. I think it's a much more nuanced and organic process, creativity, that you can't impinge a kind of system on it like purely as competition. But I think there are things, as I said, I think there are things, I want to get better at what I do is a great thing. When I interact with students, I often, or young people, talking, I often say, well, just, get better at you. That's what you need to do. And first of all, you need to know what you is. And I think that's probably more crucial. What is my path? What is my signature? At what point do I stop being a mimic of something else, and what do I start making my own paths in the snow?
All right. Full circle. You told me who you were as a child. Who is David Sheppard now?
That's a difficult question. Maybe you should address that to some of my nearest and dearest. I think I'm still a child. Actually, I still like to play. And I love this idea. There's lots of people, including actually talk about how art is adult play. Because when we're kids, what we're doing through play is we're learning how the world works. And we're trying with our building blocks. We're thinking, so that's how constructions are. We're playing, games of chase. We're interacting socially and all that stuff. And I think a lot of people, when they get to their sort of, young adulthood, they never play again, right? Suddenly it's all very serious now. We just have to do adult stuff, right? But I think art is the forum for play. That's the place where we can work things out. We can experiment. We can see, what is it to be alive? Surely it's not just going to work and earning and getting a mortgage paid or whatever. That surely isn't what we're here for. That doesn't sound like a great destiny, if it is. So art is the place to address those issues. And so I like to think that I'm still someone who has that idea of that I had when I was a kid, and also when I was a student, this idea of like experimenting with stuff to kind of to feel like I kind of belong in the world that I've spent the last 40 years in, that I actually justify. I've never woken up one morning and thought, shit, I really should have got that job in the back, whatever. I've never had that thought. I've never really had that, even when I've had harder times, economically or whatever. I've always thought I'm doing the stuff I should have done. And I think people, I would say that's who I am. I mean, David Bowie said a great, so getting older, you finally become the person you wanted to be. I may be slightly misquoting him, but it's something like that. And it's actually quite a relief, to think, okay, so I can be a kind of middle-aged version of that person I thought. Picasso said a great thing about childhood, about when he was in his 70s, saying, "I finally found my childhood again." And you can see in his last paintings, that innocence and that just innocent engagement with the world. And I also like something that Pablo Casals said, Pablo the cellist, said when he was in his 90s, and someone said to him, "It's really weird, Pablo, you're 95 and you still practice for 4 hours every day. Why do you do that?" And he said, "I think I'm finally getting somewhere." And I like that.
I do too. David Sheppard, this has been an absolute pleasure. I'm so fortunate to have discovered your work, obviously starting with Balloon, subsequent work. You mentioned we should be learning from each other. I learned a lot from you today. I learned a great deal about artistic integrity. I learned a great deal about what makes you as a musician and as a human being. And from one teacher to another teacher, thank you for being my educator today.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. It's been great. Your questions are fabulous, and it's really nice to be able to join. Because the Balloon years and what I've done subsequently can feel a bit fractured in my career, but this actually makes me join those fragments out into a kind of thread and a narrative that makes more sense to me now. So thank you for that.
You're quite welcome. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in to another special surprise cast. My name is W, host of The High Art on the Edge. Keep listening to great music. It's always there. You just have to keep your ears open. Take care. Ciao.